Welcome back. My name is Pat Beto. I'm the business editor for the PLRLR. And our next panel is entitled the Collaborative Forest Landscape Restoration Act, Collaborative Approaches to Forest Law and Policy. This panel will discuss the Collaborative Forest Landscape Restoration Act and the Southwestern Crown Collaborative, a local example of collaborative approaches to forest law and policy. Our panelists on this panel include Gordy Sanders. Gordy's the resource manager at Pyramid Mountain Lumber Company, or Lumber Incorporated. Tracy Stone Manning. Tracy's the regional director for Senator John Tester. And Gary Burnett. And Gary's the executive director of Blackfoot Challenge. The moderator for this panel is Sean Johnson. And Sean is a senior associate at the Center for Natural Resources and Environmental Policy. With that, I'm going to hand it over to Sean. Go from there.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you, Pat. And thanks to Matt and Dave and the other organizers for putting together this year's conference. It's a great lineup and pleased to be a part of it. Like Pat said, my name is Sean Johnson. I'm with the Center for Natural Resources and Environmental Policy at the University of Montana. One of the longest names out there, so we go by an acronym as well, so we feel right at home with all these federal programs. Very pleased to moderate this panel. When you think about the nature of the challenges we face and the range of interests involved, it's almost impossible to think about a solution that does not include some sort of collaboration, whether it's different stakeholders, different agencies, different perspectives. It's just really hard to come about any sort of solution without collaboration. And these particular panelists approach the topic of collaboration from three very different and interesting lenses, so I think this is going to be a very informative discussion. In talking with the panelists ahead of time, they are keeping their comments fairly brief so that we do have a lot of time to explore your questions and thoughts and interests around the topic. A couple of the things I want to throw out there ahead of time so you can be thinking about during the discussion are not only about how collaborative efforts respond to specific place-based challenges or specific either opportunity or crisis that's right on the horizon, but how the range of different collaborative efforts that are out there represent experiments that we can all learn from and use to inform policy and planning moving forward. I also want you to think about the role of federal law in policy in either enabling or constraining collaborative efforts. One of the things that you'll see in the title here is the Collaborative Forest Landscape Restoration Act, or program now, and the extent to that, whether that act and program encourage collaborative science-based ecosystem restoration, as is implied in the purpose of the act and document. Earlier today, Martin and I talked about the characteristics of ecosystem management, and he included adaptive management, collaboration, restoration, and a landscape or systems-wide approach. So think about the ability of collaborative approaches to advance one or more of those tenets. And finally, in thinking about what these people represent and the challenges that they're dealing with on a day-to-day basis, one thing that comes to bear time and time again is the human dimension. Talking about just hard work, taking responsibility, being honest, being enterprising, being fair, all of those things that we all aspire to on a day-to-day basis, but really come to bear when you talk about collaborative problem solving. And one of the hardest parts of all that is taking the risk to understand your enemy and work with them for a solution. So first up, I'd like to introduce Gary Burnett. Gary's currently the executive director of the Blackfoot Challenge. He has more than 25 years of experience in natural resource management and nonprofit development. He's worked with and for public and private landowners, managers, and others, and he's experienced in land protection and stewardship, prescribed fire, and natural areas, wildlife, and habitat management. He's developed and directed annual fund, major gift, and planned giving programs for the Rocky Mountain Elk Foundation, Missoula Children's Theater, National Forest Foundation, and Montana Meth Project. He received his BS from the University of Illinois and his master's in wildlife biology here at the University of Montana. Please join me in welcoming Gary Burnett.
Thanks, Sean. Go Grizz, right? It's an ongoing story. About half our board are Bobcats and half are Grizz, so we have a sort of ongoing sort of rivalry here. But I didn't hear any champions for the Bobcats here, so I'll just let that pass. But thanks for having us today. It's the afternoon, right? I've got slides. Don't go to sleep. I'm the only one with slides. I'll burn through them fast. There's a lot of them. But it'll kind of set the stage, I think, for this idea of the process that we involve ourselves in the Blackfoot and trying to create conservation solutions for the resources and for people. So I think, so there's where we are, Blackfoot Watershed. This is why some people know about us, because of the book that was written about the Blackfoot, but it really is true that things all do kind of run into the river, and that's what brings us together. This is another reason why people know about us. It's not necessarily because we love the Blackfoot because we live there, we work there, we play there. A lot of people are interested in this landscape because of where it's positioned on the landscape, the connection between the boreal forest and the southern Rockies. It's a fairly diverse community in terms of 3 different counties. There's a little bit of Granite County at the bottom. Just to give you kind of an idea of the diversity, it's very rural. There's only about 8,000 people in the watershed, but we're experiencing the same kind of pressures that other folks are having in other rural areas. This is really ends up why the challenge is called the Blackfoot Challenge. There's a woman in Lincoln that said when she looked at this map of the ownership pattern, she said that's going to really be a challenge. And it's actually turned out to be our opportunity, as you'll see later, in terms of public and private partnerships. It's a pretty diverse watershed, lots of resource values, wetlands, wide variety of wildlife species, including threatened and endangered species, lots of prairie habitats, kind of mostly in the middle in Lincoln area of the watershed, and then there's a lot of perennial streams, which goes back to the story we'll tell in a little bit about how we got started. But as we said, everything ends up in the river at some point, and that's what brings us together. This is really what leads us. These are 2 of the Mannix brothers, 5th-generation ranchers in Helmville, and private land ownership and private land leaders and community leaders is really what drives our efforts in terms of partnership with public managers. But like I said, we have the same problems other people have in other areas of the country in terms of changing land use patterns. We have a lot of use up in the watershed. There's a lot of recreational use, certainly mining issues we've had, grazing issues, harvest issues, weed issues. We're not unlike anybody else in terms of dealing with those issues, and we're really concerned that we end up with a train wreck here eventually between the watershed and the resource threats. One of the things that Sean asked us to do is kind of talk about 4 different things in terms of the first one being what compelled the group to get together, and really it was concerns over the Blackfoot River. In about late 1980s or early 1990, the American Rivers came out and said the Blackfoot River is one of the 10 most endangered rivers in the country. And that got everybody's attention. So is it still working? It's not reverberating as much now. You guys can hear it in the back? So what that got together is everybody said, what do you mean the Blackfoot River's one of the 10 most endangered rivers in the country? Everybody thought things were going pretty good. So that started generating a lot of dialogue about concerns over the river. And it turns out it's the 1,900 miles of perennial stream where the issues are, but that brought some focus to the watershed in terms of having community meetings looking at what people were concerned about in the watershed. And it turns out that we needed to make sure we were looking at the whole ridge-to-ridge aspect in a watershed approach, because it wasn't just the river. We realized it's all the tributaries and all the lands that are connected in the watershed. So we formed a partnership between public and private partners focused on our mission coming from the people about their concerns about conserving natural resources and their rural way of life in the Blackfoot. This is, I think, probably if you could print a slide and take it home, this is the one you'd want to take home. This is the key to everything that we do. This is the process we follow. What we do with that process and where we go with that process has to do with the people that are involved with that process. So being inclusive and trying to get everybody at the table and trying to find some consensus on how to operate, it's messy, it takes a long time, but it's the process that's allowed us, as you'll see at the end of the slideshow, to produce an awful lot of conservation outcomes and community benefits. Our board is structured to make sure that's represented. The board is really based on communication and building trust and trying to find ways to work together more effectively. It's a fairly structured board setup in terms of making sure that we have public and private partnerships. The public land management agencies all sit on that board. They all have a standing seat on that board. And so Tim Love is with us today, and he's a district ranger in Sealy. Amber Camps also sits on the board. Bureau of Land Management, Fish, Wildlife and Parks, DNRC, Fish Wildlife Service, all have standing seats on the board. Caroline Bird, who's with us today, represents the conservation seat, represented now by the Nature Conservancy. Plum Creek Timber sits on the board. The balance of the board then is made up of private leaders within the 7 communities in the watershed. So again, this leadership model of community leaders and our agency partners coming together on a regular basis to share information and find places that we can work together. We're structured in about 7 different committee structure here. These are all led by board members. I'm going to go through these kind of quick here because we really want to talk a little bit about some forestry issues we're dealing with in the watershed and share with you some solutions we found. But essentially, conservation strategies is trying to keep the landscape intact, trying to keep working land working, keep it available for natural resource conservation and for the rural communities. This is a project you've probably heard of. This is the precursor of the Montana Legacy Project. So this original project bought 89,000 acres of Plum Creek Timber Company land in partnership directly with the Nature Conservancy. The job was the Nature Conservancy put the deal together, managed the deal, had the relationship with Plum Creek Timber Company to pull that off. The Blackfoot Challenge's job was to do the disposition back into the community in terms of public and private conservation ownerships. The resulting one, and you'll get back to this further, was there's a piece called the Blackfoot Community Conservation Area. This is about 5,600 acres of tidal land that the Challenge owns, encompassed by a 41,000 acre larger landscape that's managed by a 15-member citizens-based council, very much like a resource advisory committee setup. And so that committee, that council manages this area from day to day, and it was primarily because of concerns locally over continued access and availability of that resource up there outside of Ovando. Education Committee, obviously we're trying to get people more involved with the long-term sustainable solutions here. We do a lot of outreach, which is really what we're doing today in terms of talking about the work we do and how this transferability might occur. Water resources, as you can imagine, there's a lot of need for water resources, whether it's irrigation or fish. We could go into a lot of details about some of the programs we're doing to try to solve some of those issues and conserve that resource. Weeds Committee, this is originally really what brought us together. It's pretty easy. Anybody concerned about weeds in this room? Anybody? Anybody not concerned about weeds? Pretty good consensus issue. So it's a good place to start in terms of working together. This is a little bit, this is like a no-lose or no-win situation for both these parties here, all 3 of them. The one's doing better than the other in this situation, but this is not good for either party. So we started a wildlife conflict program a few years ago trying to deal with this situation. I'm mostly going to just show you some slides here. Waste management, it's a pretty combined effort, neighborhood network. So if you see this guy outside, you're supposed to call your neighbors and let people know that he's coming around and maybe he's going to get in trouble and you're going to have some resource damage. A carcass pickup program basically just pulls livestock off the landscape. It doesn't have an attractant then for wildlife anymore. Fencing, grizzly bears don't like hot electric fence, and as long as that's on, you can protect calving areas and beehives with those fences. Range Rider program, pretty good program in terms of really focusing on the new issue of wolves and really trying to create communication between landowners and agencies in terms of solutions we can do in terms of managing this resource collaboratively. So now we're going to get into the meat and potatoes, what we're going to talk about a little bit. We'll talk a little bit about some of the programs we're doing. It's focused mostly on fire management and forest restoration and the juxtaposition between those two across boundaries between public and private ownerships. So in terms of fire management, I won't go through all the details, but essentially we're trying to provide a one-stop shop for private landowners to participate in landscape-level fire management. We did an assessment in the watershed, mostly to try to focus where we should operate in terms of where the risks are. When you get into forest restoration, which is kind of the topic of the day here, it gets messier in terms of there's not as much zone of agreement on forest restoration. There's a lot of zone of agreement, as Gordy will probably talk about, with low elevation ponderosa pine. We're just moving into a mixed conifer stands in terms of trying to figure out how to restore that landscape. So this is the Montana Forest Restoration Committee. I'm sure Gordy will visit about that. It's a working model for us in terms of the Collaborative Forest Landscape Restoration Act. It's important for that piece. There's a project called the Multi-Agency Integrated Restoration Strategy, which essentially is state-level agencies coming together and say there must be places in Montana where we can find ways to work together and try to streamline our operations and do more cross-boundary work. Our role is then to try to bring private landowners into that same process in terms of forest restoration and fire management. So that's just the project area we're working on right now. So this is the topic as we started off. This is the CFLRA Act. And so we were one of 10 projects nationally selected out of this. Debbie Austin's in the audience today, and she co-chairs that collaboration with Scott Brennan from the Wilderness Society. And so this group came together several years ago. What compelled us to come together? Opportunities to do good work on the landscape, opportunities to bring resources in that would benefit natural resource conservation and our communities. And so a wide group of folks came together, and as it says at the top, we're actively working to expand our membership. I would say that we would always be looking at including more value sets onto the table here to understand how we can reach consensus on which kinds of projects to move forward with. So it's a wide group of people here. This is a big list of stuff. I'm not going to go through the whole thing, but you can go online, you can look for it there. That's a lot of outcomes on the ground. There's probably something up there for everybody in the room, everybody in this area in terms of things that mean something to them in terms of outcomes. Just in general, if you look at the dollars related to what that looks like, the first one is really the outcomes. This is a general idea of what the dollars represent for that. The reason the watershed restoration, road, trail, and other restoration work is such a big piece of the pie is that it's so expensive to do that road type work, that stream type work. So that really represents the dollar value of what we hope to accomplish over 10 years. Now I'm just going to quickly give you some other ideas of some community work we've done, some collaborative work. As I mentioned, the Blackfoot Community Conservation Area, the council put together that management plan. Basically, they've done 2 projects I'm going to show you here really quick. Again, fire management, forest restoration. Really just trying to create a primary line of defense between public ground and private ground along that dotted line. So this is a before, that's an after. Really just trying to create about a 200-foot zone along there for fire management's sake. Again, a before and an after shot there. And then, of course, we're trying to create jobs, utilize that fiber again with a partner there that came in with some collaborative dollars. We were able to utilize some of the fiber there that normally with the markets going down we might not have been able to utilize. This is a project we did with Pyramid Mountain Lumber Company. So Gordy's very familiar with this project. This was a restoration project in the low elevation Ponderosa Pine Forest. This is the council out there deliberating very handedly in terms of what you'll see next. This is there in the rough fescue zone, and what they wanted to do is essentially extend that. You can see the lines in the map between this park and that park. And you can imagine this is a wide variety of community-based people coming together to do active forest management, taking out trees, thinning it out, basically trying to retain the Ponderosa Pine overstory and really rebuild the rough fescue community before it's lost. So it's a good project. We got about 150 acres or 300 acres done between the 2 different parks, I think. Just a little bit of activity there. If we were in a forestry conference, I'd kind of give you about 20 different slides on that stuff just to show you active management, but I know we don't have that much time. And we're certainly trying to create jobs and service the local economy, so that's part of the equation. So just in sort of general summary, we got a lot of partners that we work with, from private to federal, state, counties, businesses, nonprofits. We've gotten a lot of work done over a couple years in terms of a lot of outcomes here. The next 2 slides is the easiest ones to look at. This is the 1996, what the conservation lands look like in that area, and this is what they look like today. So if you want to know if collaboration works, it can work if you follow an inclusive, consensus-based process and you give yourself some time to accomplish that, because you realize that was 1996, this is 2011, and really we started working on this kind of an idea a long time before that. So the other thing that Sean wanted to know is what constrains the partners. As I said, time, resources, trust. So if we have enough time, we have enough resources, we can probably work together and try to build that trust and work on some things together. What sustains us, we really need participation. Participation today, this kind of stuff, this is what's going to solve our problems, is by working together on things. And so by communicating and building trust and working together, we think we'll have better rural communities through this idea of cooperative conservation. That's it.
Thank you very much, Gary. That was terrific. We're going to switch gears now and the slideshows. And next up, we have Tracy Stone Manning. Give you a little short bio here. Tracy is currently the regional director for Senator Jon Tester, based here in Missoula. She advises him on natural resource issues, and she's a key staffer on his Forest Jobs and Restoration Act. Before joining Senator Tester's staff 4 years ago, she was the executive director of the Clark Fork Coalition, where she conceived of and led the effort to remove the Milltown Dam and the sediments behind it. She was the founder of Headwaters News, and she started her career as director of the Five Valleys Land Trust here in Missoula. She holds a master's degree in environmental studies right here from the University of Montana. So another Grizz. Welcome.
Oh, I don't know. Calling me a Grizz is a stretch. Thank you very much for having me today. It's a great pleasure to be here. I'm going to talk much more broadly about collaboration and how that does or does not fit into public policy with sort of two examples. And I'm also going to sort of ask you to think about collaboration, especially when it comes to forest work. You just saw that spectacular map that Gary showed about collaboration in and around private lands and what landowners working together as neighbors can do for their watershed. And a lot of that has to do with public lands, but when you're focusing collaboration only on public lands, and when you're focusing collaboration only on public lands that involved the forest, it's a kind of different thing. And it requires different elements in part. Or as Gary so nicely put it, it gets messier. It really gets messier. And if you look at the Forest Service across time and what Americans have done on public lands, I think one could argue that the reason that there is collaboration now it is because the system of laws that we have to guide our forest management, frankly, no longer serves us properly. And so that's a much, much larger conversation for many, many, many more conferences and many, many, probably, unfortunately, more years in Congress. But I think that you'll see that each of these ideas across Montana, across the West, were come by because people were fed up. They're tired of fighting, and they were tired of not getting their perceived agenda done. And so they finally said, all right, we're done. Like, fighting hasn't worked for 30 years, so let's see what not fighting looks like. And so the big question then becomes, do our laws serve that? And I'm not going to deign to answer that question today, but it is certainly a question for the Public Land Law Review to consider over time. All of these collaborative efforts, I think, also provide an insight and a model. And I think that it's a very healthy and a really good thing that they're happening because they are providing lessons on the ground as we speak to that larger national question of, does the system work? And that's exactly why I think my boss took on the Forest Jobs and Recreation Act. He took it on for several reasons, not the least of which were people rolled up their sleeves, they stopped fighting, they came up with a solution, and they brought it to him and said, would you introduce this? And back in Washington, people who normally fight with each other are not rolling up their sleeves and saying, hey, let's find a solution. And when Montanans did that, John said, I need to take this solution back to Washington. You know, every weekend he comes home, he hears people say, what is wrong with you people back there? Why can't you work together? And here he's got his own constituents doing the very hard work of working together and coming up with a solution. And that is one of the large reasons that he decided to introduce it and move ahead sort of vigorously with it. I'm not going to go into the very tiny details of what it is, just because we don't have the time, and I'm assuming a bunch of folks in this room already know, but I am going to sort of broad brush it for people who might be new to the state and new to the issue. Forest Jobs and Recreation Act is the outcome of 3 different collaborations on the ground. One up in northwest Montana on the Kootenai National Forest, one in Gordy's neck of the woods, Gordy was one of the partners, on the Sealy district of the Lolo National Forest, and one on the entire Beaverhead Deer Lodge National Forest. These 3 sort of collaborations were moving ahead all at the same time, sort of not unbeknownst, but they weren't working together. Senator Tester was elected and sworn into office in January of 2007, and I'm pretty sure by the end of that month, we had drafts of one, if not all 3, saying, Senator Tester, would you introduce this legislation? We've been working really hard on it. So he looked at all 3 of them. He saw that there were very similar threads among the 3. Those threads were something to some form of certainty for timber production and watershed restoration, some sort of certainty for the recreation community, and wilderness designation. We've not had a single acre of wilderness designated in the state of Montana for 20, I think now 8 years. And as many of you know, it's been considered sort of the third rail of politics, but the people who made it the third rail were the people who jointly came together and asked the senator to introduce this bill. He looked at all 3 proposals. He said, boy, there's a lot of similarities. Why don't we roll those into one, learn from all 3 places, and see what that learning provides for the larger story of forest management in the West and forest management nationally. There was a second reason he also introduced it, and you all see it every day. Our forests are in a bad state of disrepair. More and more, we see the beetle infestation sweeping across the landscape. We see people frustrated that people have this perception that we're doing nothing about it. And we've lost mills. We lost one of the partners in the Forest Jobs and Recreation Act. Smurfit Stone was one of the folks who brought it to the senator. That's 400 jobs that are no longer in Missoula, and more importantly, no outlet for pulp, which is such a huge part, and chips, which is such a huge part of the timber infrastructure in Montana. So the senator looked at our neighbors to the south and southwest and saw states that literally don't have any more mills. So even if we choose to manage our landscape, we have no way to do that because we don't have the infrastructure to actually take care of to process the wood, and more importantly, we don't have the sort of human infrastructure to know how to do it, to know how to go into the wood and take care of watersheds, and to know how to cut down a tree and know how to mill a log. And when that infrastructure goes away, both human-wise and physically, the physical infrastructure, it's viciously expensive to bring it back, almost impossible. So he looked at this crisis on the landscape and said, yeah, we don't have time, we need to introduce this and we need to get her done. So he's been pushing hard, and we came very close last December with the close of the Congress, very close. And my boss said, well, okay, didn't work this time, but we're going to try again next time. And he is actively looking as we speak to find some piece of legislation to attach the bill to so that it can get to the president's desk. There's a separate collaborative effort out there that was referenced earlier, the Forest Landscape Restoration Act, which was passed by Senator Bingaman, supported by Senator Tester. There are 10 projects nationwide that are a part of that program. One of them is right here in the Sealy district with Gordy and Tim and a bunch of the partners, and Gary, a bunch of the partners in the room. And so that that's going, and it's going well. Senator Tester just got out on the ground and took a look at the project a couple weeks ago. It provides the certainty that folks are looking for in a different way. I think to get to certainty with any piece of management you do, you need a couple things. one of them is collaboration, right? You need consensus, you need collaboration. That's a given. So that's in the Collaborative Forest Landscape Restoration Act. It's written right in. Group of people have to agree on a proposal, bring that proposal forward. It's a huge part of it. It's a huge part of the Forest Jobs and Recreation Act. That act is about people coming together to create watershed restoration projects. Collaboration has to be a part of it. It's right there written into the law. There's a second way to get at certainty, especially for the timber side as well. One of them, through the Forest Jobs and Restoration Act, Recreation Act, is mandates. Right? So that act says to the Forest Service, you will treat X number of acres a year on the landscape. As you know, that's the controversial part of the act. Congress has never before told the agency, you will treat X number of acres a year. And here in this one little experiment, this one pilot project, Congress will be telling the agency to do that. So that's one way to get at the certainty. Another way to get at the certainty is to provide quite a bit of money, right? So through the Collaborative Forest Landscape Restoration Act, there's money on the table. You guys all agree, and we're going to match money to get this restoration work done. Two different approaches. We're going to learn from both of them, and we're going to learn different things, and I think we're going to learn really useful things. So because the money is key to CFLRA, the senator in his work on the Appropriations Committee is trying to make sure that that funding stays in place. We've had a good year of it behind us. We've got 9 more to go to really get the work done on the landscape that's necessary, and then also to learn from that work. So it's just 2 different paths, and I think we're going to learn equally interesting things from both. And then lastly, maybe, one of the problems with the Collaborative Forest Landscape Restoration Act, and we could put Debbie on the spot and maybe ask her questions during the Q&A, is also about money. It was not written into the legislation that the money would be for doing the analysis. As we all know, because projects are so subject to litigation and deep analysis from those who want to perhaps fight it, the NEPA work has to be good. And it takes a lot of money to get good NEPA work done. And that money was not provided in the act. So we have this issue of how do we make sure then that the analysis gets done so that those restoration dollars can flow. That's an issue. We're working on it. You always learn in hindsight at legislation, right? It passes, people begin to implement it, and they think, "Ooh, we need NEPA money." So that's out there, and it's probably part of the discussion we'll have in the Q&A. Collaboration is it's an incredibly important thing. It's also an incredibly illustrative thing. People are forced to the table because through frustration, and what we can hope is that once they get to the table and once they begin to work together, we will all learn about how things can run better, more smoothly, with better outcomes for both the public and the landscape through these projects. And I'm pretty convinced that what we learn will inform a much bigger national discussion. So I look forward to the discussion. Thank you.
All right, Tracy, thank you very much. That was very helpful and informative in thinking more broadly about the different issues that surround collaboration, where the interface is with the different federal laws that are out there that can help or constrain the work on the ground. So now I'm going to turn to Gordy. Gordy Sanders is the resource manager for Pyramid Mountain Lumber. He's worked there since 1996. In addition, Gordy's career includes more than 20 years with Champion International Corporation and several years with Plum Creek Timber Company. His extra career activities are both extensive and impressive. He has long been active in the Society of American Foresters, where he served as the Montana chair and a member of the National Committee on Forest Policy, and he currently serves as chair of the Montana Policy Committee. He's been recognized as the Society of American Foresters' Outstanding Citizen and Forester of the Year. He's been coordinator of the Western Governors Association Conference Montana Field Day event, and he's currently co-chair of the Montana Forest Recreation Committee. He's co-authored the Montana Streamside Management Act and the Streamside Management Zone Guidebook. He holds a bachelor's degree in forest and range management from the University of Minnesota and a master's in forest and range management from Washington State. And before I let Gordy take the podium here, one thing that occurred to me as I was preparing these bios and reading through them is that these people bring so many different perspectives to the table in their own right that each of them could be a collaborative process just by bringing the different hats to bear that they've had through their careers and experiences. So I think they're the right people to be speaking to us about collaboration today. With that, Gordy.
Thanks, Sean. Appreciate the opportunity to be here, and so we're each a collaborative process.
You could be.
We could, well, maybe we are more than you think. Well, it's a pleasure to be here. I want to give you a little bit of background about Pyramid Mountain Lumber first. And I'll start out by saying, you know, when I get into the discussion on collaboration, not everybody in industry agrees with me, but I'm right. Pyramid Mountain Lumber, we're a small family-owned mill owned and operated in Seeley Lake for over 60 years. Same families are involved that built the mill in 1949. We're a board mill and a random length dimension sawmill. We go after niche markets. Since the very beginning, the owners have avoided these commodity markets where all you're doing is producing, let's say, studs. So it's highly competitive and very focused, and you're totally then tied to housing starts. So it's helped us stay in business for the length of time we have. We're dedicated to helping forest landowners sustain their forests for present and future generations. We spend a lot of time working with landowners. Private landowners probably provide about 70%, 60 to 70% of what we utilize. The Forest Service is somewhere between 12% and 25%, and then state is always somewhere around 10%, along with BIA, BLM, and others. We use 35 truckloads a day of logs, every day. And so we're plenty busy. We're doing fine. I mean, we're still here. That's a major accomplishment. We're still here. We're one of 7 or 8 major companies left in Montana. All the mills are about 100 miles apart or more. So that makes a huge difference on what you can get done on the ground. And as Tracy said, you start looking at the Southwest and other locations, they have no infrastructure. There are no mills, there are no loggers, there's no way to make things happen unless the government pays. And I can tell you, here you can get work done, restoration work, $400 to $500, $600 an acre, that in New Mexico is costing $3,000 to $10,000 an acre because there's nobody there. We have none of our own land, so we're totally dependent on all other landowners. Private landowners are an interesting group. Some call them UFOs, unidentified forest owners. But they're a diverse group. They're doctors, attorneys, movie stars, cowboys. You've got the whole range of values that we're dealing with all the time. And so we have this long history of working with a lot of different folks with a lot of different perspectives and values, and I think that helps us put things into perspective when we take a look at things like collaboration. Now, I want to back up a little bit. You know, collaboration, my dictionary, it says either work with the enemy, and I don't think that really fits. It's how about working with others? And I think I heard a comment earlier about understanding your enemy. Both Pyramid Mountain Lumber and myself have been involved interacting with conservation community folks forever. I mean, it's something that we do, something we've always done, and it's perfectly natural for us to do that. So working with other interests is commonplace for Pyramid, And in the 80s, we worked with the Montana Wilderness Association and others to identify specific, to actually delineate wildlands for permanent protection as wilderness. So how did we get to the southwest crown of the continent? And, you've heard a lot. One of the benefits of kind of being last on a panel is a lot of the good stuff's already been said. We built a solid foundation of cooperative conservation and public-private partnerships through successful collaborative efforts. All of these are the result of handpicking individuals that represent certain interests to be involved in a specific project with the expectation that they're going to interact and network with their trap line and other folks to bring important information to the table that would be helpful to move forward. And when you, on these collaboratives, it has to be balanced. You can't have 9 timber industry folks at the table and 1 conservation community person. Of course, I don't think you could get 9 industry people at the table because there aren't that many of us to go around. You always strategize for success, pick the place and the people to help achieve a successful outcome. And it's particularly true when you're trying something new, a different approach, a different way of doing things. I think that helps. Folks come together and participate in a collaborative because there's something in it for them, for their interest. And they can visualize what the common ground is. Is it it's frustration, or it's opportunity, or it's some combination of both. But the most common is getting more of the right thing done on the ground for the right reason. This is all about doing more. A couple of examples is, and I won't go back too far in history, but one of them that Tracy mentioned, the Blackfoot Clearwater Stewardship Pilot, which began with a discussion between John Gatchell and I. He's with the Montana Wilderness Association 7 years ago after a forest planning meeting, talking about, is there something we can do to fully implement the forest plan? And obviously fully implementing the plan meant you're going to designate wilderness, knowing that nothing had even been talked about since 1988 and a little bit in 91. So we identified key people, stakeholders, people who will help us be successful and were truly necessary to move some piece of legislation forward. So our vision was to not only designate wilderness, but provide resources to the Forest Service which would ensure active forest management was protectable and activities would happen on the ground that would provide some level of certainty for industry, but they have to have the resources to do the analysis work and come up with a biomass plant at Pyramid's plant site in Seeley Lake. From the very beginning, recognize this was 2005, we understood that all the pieces could go forward at different times through different vehicles. That was just a fact. And I will say the last thing you want to do is approach something legislatively in an act because what I think is right, what Tracy thinks is right, or Gary or whoever, isn't necessarily what Congress thinks. And things can change over time. A different effort, in August of 2006, a facilitated group of interest got together to see if it was worthwhile to get a broader base group together and see if we could develop a zone of agreement around forest restoration on national forest lands. So in January 2007, we convened a group of 34, pared down from a list of 150. And that list included, there were Forest Service folks on that list that sat in that room. We also handpicked who we wanted involved from the Forest Service. There's a couple of them here, 3 exactly, I think. So we worked hard to develop what we called the Zone of Agreement. August of 2007, we created the Montana Forest Restoration Committee's 13 principles, which has kind of set the stage of where people were comfortable. And the expectation for all of us is that that zone of agreement will stretch over time. We're just not going to settle in on that individual, the first 13. It takes time, but I think really in these collaboratives, the longer they're together and the harder the information, the issues they're dealing with, the faster they move over time. It doesn't have to take a lot of time, and collaboration can be managed. It's not necessarily consensus. Consensus is a great thing, but collaboration can be managed in terms of time frame. Well, in addition to those couple of things, there's a number of other activities that those of us involved in those efforts were also pursuing. So all the time we're growing. The level of trust has long since been there before Senator Bingham's bill was passed in the spring of 2009. When it passed, Bob Eakey with the Wilderness Society called me, and he said, do you suppose this bill could satisfy the certainty piece in the Blackfoot Clearwater Stewardship Pilot legislation that we had envisioned that would be helpful for industry? And I said, yeah, sounds like an opportunity to get more predictable work done on the ground over a 10-year time frame, providing the resources to get that work done. And the very next call he made was to Scott Brennan, that works for him, the co-chairs, who called Debbie, and then in the meantime I called the 3 rangers involved. So everything kind of moved quickly because we already had the relationships. These long-term relationships were already in place, and the question about what compelled people to get together, it's kind of like it's what we do. So most of us are far more opportunistic. But it still goes back to people want more done on the ground. So that surfaced in 2009, and then 2 months later, Senator Tester's office contacted us, specifically Tracy, with the Blackfoot Clearwater Stewardship Pilot, to see if we had an interest in seeing our collaborative merged together with with the others that she mentioned in the Forest Jobs and Recreation Act. And we looked at that opportunity and decided that it would be beneficial. It was a way to satisfy those folks that are sitting around the table in this collaborative in achieving what they wanted to accomplish. It was wilderness, and then also provide some additional certainty in terms of getting more work done on the ground that accomplishes everybody's interest. So we took that on, and was there a downside? I mean, we weighed this heavily. Do we want to get involved or not? Or there hasn't been a downside to anything we've pursued so far. And I think collaborative efforts are incredibly valuable to all the interests at the table, and the vehicle which helps really move things forward, legislation, incredibly helpful, but also to satisfy the interests of people, those interests at the table, is through stewardship contracting, where you can bundle together multiple kinds of projects, whether it's fisheries, wildlife, road obliteration, fuel reduction projects, and get more work done on the ground. And so it sounds like everything's kind of piggybacked together. It really is. I mean, it's really woven together. Nobody had a master plan X number of years ago, but when we're, and for a small company like Pyramid, being opportunistic is what makes us tick. It's one of the reasons we're still here, and we'll create opportunities to take advantage of. And we've had restoration and stewardship contracts on private lands, a whole number of stewardship contracts with Forest Service and BLM. So with this perfect picture, it's kind of like, what's in the way? What doesn't work? And you kind of heard it from Tracy and Gary. It's capacity. And mostly, there's some capacity question on the part of those that are involved in collaboratives. There's only so many of us in the industry to go around. There's only so many people to participate in these collaborative efforts. And most folks have a full-time job. But it's mostly with the Forest Service. Every one of these collaborative efforts exists to get more work done on the ground, not just different work. Everyone wants to see more. And so that takes more resources. And the southwest crown of the continent, having those available resources are hugely beneficial in terms of implementation. Then in terms of the analysis part, the agency is in a trade-off situation. Okay, so who's not going to get funded because you need those resources to do this additional analysis work? And, it'd be great if everybody was funded equally, but from an industry perspective, we do look out for our own. And if it happens that most of the work is close by, that's okay. But the bottom line is, if more doesn't get done on the ground, I don't care what the reason is, don't care if it's appeals or litigation or whatever, if more work doesn't get on the ground, I would predict that all the collaboratives would wind up unraveling over time. Just talking about things or producing a piece of paper, and I think Tim Love made the perfect comment when he said, when the decision is signed, when the NEPA work is done, it's only the beginning. The bulk of everything that happens comes after that decision. So it's really critical that it's done right, done well on the ground, and achieves the overall purpose and need of the agency. So I'll just end right there with, don't be victims of little thinking. That's another Tim Love quote. And thinking big, the mainstream conservation community folks like large landscape level thinking because it helps answer the question, why here, why now? Up until that time, it's why is this 50 acres or why is this 25 acres or this 100 acres? Always the assumption by the critics that we're going to go cut all the old growth trees. And I do find it interesting that the process, everyone wants to speed up the process, shorten the timeline from the start of a project to actually implementation and a decision. And it's interesting to me that folks in the environmental community that are so involved in all these projects they were fairly irritated the first time they realized what the timeline looked like, that it would take 2 or 3 years to come up with a decision. So everybody's working at it. Well, again, that builds a bigger middle of people, of folks that have different interests that would like to get something done. And I think open and honest dialogue with the agency is incredibly important. And I think all of our Forest Service partners, those that are interacting in all the restoration committees, have been hugely, really opened up. And that makes a big difference in terms of how people trust the agency professionals. So that's it.
All right, thank you, Gordy. I'm going to go ahead and start with the question and answer period here with a question of my own. I hope no one's offended by that. And then we'll get it out to the rest of the audience. And I'm going to ask Pat to help me with running a microphone around to people so we can hear your questions. But one of the things that I've been thinking about in terms of who's in the audience today and public land and policy, and then the interface with the collaborative efforts that we've just heard about, and then finally this issue of capacity that seems to be a refrain that we heard in each of the talks this afternoon. How have federal laws and policies changed over time to help facilitate more on-the-ground work in collaborative efforts, whether they're, a Blackfoot Challenge type endeavor, or something that's more along the legislative proposal of the Forest Jobs and Recreation Act. So we heard a little bit about restoration stewardship contracts. There's the Partners in Fish and Wildlife program, and there are others. But if you guys could just kind of pick up that question of how is the federal government and your federal partners doing in changing over time to adapt to some of these challenges on the ground and providing the partnerships with the capacity they need to be effective?
Oh, okay. I will make a comment in that I was involved in the Bureau of Land Management National Stewardship Training Session here in Missoula in June. And it was interesting to me to hear folks from Washington, D.C., and they were showing accomplishments in terms of stewardship contracting in the, around the country. And commonly, they were talking in terms of 10,000 to 70,000 acre projects. And he was explaining to all the folks that were there that this is the norm. This is where we're going. So when you talk about capacity issues, you know, when you think large landscape levels, then you can get more done rather than individual, very small projects that take just as much time, effort, and energy for all of the specialists. So, and I think the agency, I think the Forest Service is moving that way. And we'd like to see everybody have a 10-year, 100,000 acre stewardship contract. All from the company perspective, that would be great.
Building on what Gordy just said, Region 1 of the Forest Service is putting together those 10-year long-term stewardship contracts. I sat in a meeting where they said, well, we looked at Senator Tester's Forest Jobs and Recreation Act, and we thought, well, we just better get started on that with the tools we have now. And so we're going to, and with quite a bit of pushing from our office to, you have the social license to think big, right? Start thinking bigger. If you're going to get sued on a 100-acre sale, why not just go get sued on a 50,000-acre watershed restoration scale? That thinking bigger is incredibly necessary for the resource. And you have the social license, I think, now to go do that. But getting back to your question, Sean, like what has the federal government done? Well, NIFMA's pretty static. What's not static is all of the court decisions built on it, right? So that has changed over time, but the underlying law itself has not. And I think that's partly why we're in the quagmire we're in, especially here in Region 1, which is the highest litigated region in the country. And frankly, I confess, when I came to this job, I came from work in the conservation field, and I followed forest issues, but just followed them. And I thought, oh, surely they're exaggerating. Surely they're exaggerating, and that it's not this big of an issue. It is that big of an issue. It is that big of an issue. There we go. Litigation is real, and it has the agency now censoring itself. And so projects became smaller and smaller and smaller, in part because it was all about, will this get sued? How much money do I have to fight this in court? And so when an agency, when any bureaucracy starts censoring itself, you got a problem.
Kind of a hard act to follow, but I guess I'll just start off and say there are sort of two broad recommendations private landowners and public managers have come forward to discuss, and that's this idea of, as Gordy said, capacity and flexibility. And what I would say is that it's not as simple as, who should participate at the table. We think everybody should participate. You need leadership from communities, you need leadership from agencies. So it's about the leadership together, that partnership of those folks that do have, as Tracy says, the ability to go forth and get things done. So we've seen that on the ground. We're working at it every day, and we do think we have probably enough capacity to work together initially right now to do that. What we're going to need is long-term the ability to keep funding our work to work together. And so do we need to make some tweaks on things? Probably. Again, can you provide more flexibility in the way federal partners respond to local communities? Probably. They have a lot of flexibility right now. What we really need to do is continue to work together on it, find those local leaders, find those local partners to work together on issues. I think we've shown that we can get things done, and we can help other people try to figure out how to get that done as well.
All right, are there any questions from the audience at this point?
Could we ask people in the audience questions?
Yeah, or can we turn it over to them? Yeah.
Well, I don't want to put Debbie or Tim on the spot either, but if they had any additional thoughts to lend from the Forest Service perspective on the Collaborative Forest Landscape Restoration Act, the program, the specific collaborative in the Southwest, I think that would be informative to hear from your perspective at some point. And the other question I'm going to throw out for my panelists to start thinking about is this idea that all of these collaboratives kind of have a feedback loop in terms of informing national policy. So what are the different outboxes to help inform either Senator Tester's office, other congressional members, the administration, in what's working and what's not? So let's throw that out there.
I think this is actually a little window into the next panel about forests and media. I think that there are two different sort of boxes that are being checked, right? We have one national conversation in the media, and frankly, it's often not the right, it's just not the right discussion. Because we're supposed to do, because reporters are supposed to call one side and then call the other side, those two sides talk over each other in a story, and yet the broad middle is not heard from. So over and over again, our partners doing their work went out and took opinion polls on the Forest Jobs and Recreation Act. It's got 2/3 support in this state. But if you ask people on the street, well, what do you think? Boy, it sounds controversial. They go, oh, it's really controversial. Well, that's because they're reading in the paper that he said this and she said that. And they're missing the broader story of where agreement really lies, right? And that he said, she said is what informs policymakers. So it's a bit of an issue and a bit of a problem. Surely somebody has a question.
Oh,
There we go.
A couple questions.
All right, put your hands up if you.
Hi, thank you. We have representatives from a couple different types of collaboratives up there, and I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about the legislated approach versus more of the Blackfoot Challenge agreement type approach, and when each is kind of indicated and the best choice of course of action. Thanks.
I'll just start off with sort of a bit of our story about how we've worked on that. The story of the Blackfoot Challenge really started back in the 1970s, really, and it's really started over the idea of designating the Blackfoot as Wild and Scenic River. And so some landowners got together, Land Lindbergh and Hank Getz of Notable, and said there's got to be a way we can share this resource with people without providing the overburden of regulation and legislation that restricts sort of local activities. So to this day, when you access the Blackfoot, you will probably be accessing it on certain times on private ground that's leased to Fish, Wildlife, and Parks through a public-private agreement. So we were able to solve that problem through cooperation, through collaboration between public and private entities by getting together. These are good friends, these were neighbors, a landowner next to Lubrick National to Experimental Forest, so they knew each other well, and they said there's got to be a way we can share this. And so if you couldn't have solved that problem, what would have happened? Well, maybe something would have come in and somebody would have told us how we're going to solve that problem. But the basic premise from local communities, whether they're urban or rural, is say, give us a chance to solve it first. And if we don't have a chance to do that through voluntary and incentive-based processes, then we get why you might come in later and knock us over the head and tell us to get together and actually solve some of these problems.
Just a comment too, in terms of legislation, no one can designate wilderness except Congress. So if, when we're dealing with folks from the Wilderness Society, Montana Wilderness Association and others, and you're working together in a collaborative, the objective is and the commitment is each of us is going to help each other see their piece of the interest, at the end of whenever, we call it successful. And so I think there are things, so if you're going to go down that track, then it begs the question, okay, are there other things that would be helpful in moving that forward? Just like Tracy talked about, there's appeals and litigation, and then there's different processes today that actually are a little more streamlined and they can facilitate things moving forward, whether it's the Healthy Forest Restoration Act and some other processes that have been talked about. So, and then I'll say, everyone involved in these collaboratives has been involved in this for a long time. Different places, different times, and some things don't change, but over time, some things do.
Good afternoon. Thank you very much. I've been very, very interested in hearing all the talks today, and one of the things I've heard often and a lot recently is the need to look at the larger landscapes, especially for our projects, the 1,000 versus 70,000 acres. As a reluctant student of regulations, however, I have been at a loss to understand where the regulations allow us to do that more easily than 1,000 acres. So I understand the social need and the environmental need to look at these larger landscapes, but I just am wondering if there's an expectation that it will be easier to get through the regulations. And so kind of spurred on by the question about regulatory sideboards, I was just wondering if anybody is thinking that there are ways we can work within the current regulations and yet have to do less analysis at these large scales, or whether perhaps we're going to need some kind of regulatory solution. One phrase that I think of often is back in the 70s, I remember as a kid learning that dilution is not the solution to pollution. And that's kind of what I keep thinking is, well, is larger landscape the solution to analysis? I don't know. So anyhow, just wondering about your thoughts on that.
Well, Senator Tester thinks that some regulation help is needed. He certainly heard that from the Forest Service. And so we tried very hard in the Forest Jobs and Recreation Act to provide provide the agency with some tools to be able to do that large landscape look without, in a more streamlined fashion. So, for example, extending the Healthy Forest Restoration Act authority to a broader landscape and to restoration activities as well as just hazardous fuel reduction, right? So these 70,000 acre projects will have NEPA analysis that looks at two alternatives. One, the project, and two, no action, unless another collaborative brings a third. So that's one tool. Giving some of the judicial relief that HFRA also has, that's also written into the senator's bill, so that a judge gets to look at balance of harms when reviewing a project. Using the objections process as opposed to the appeals process, we think will help. So those are some of the regulatory framework that that he wrote into the law so that, we can try something else for those sort of large landscape looks. And that changed quite a bit from when the bill was first introduced in 2009 until just at the end of last year. And it changed quite a bit because of the feedback we heard from practitioners on the ground and from agency folks. So the vision and the outcomes are the same. How we get there, we fine-tuned.
I think also there's, currently there's discussions going on within CEQ, in terms of, these five pilot projects, and I'm not sure there's any in Montana, but they're looking at how to streamline the process. So, what's driving all this is they're getting feedback from a lot of folks from the conservation community and others that things take way too long. And I think you guys, Forest Service is incredibly good at process. I mean, you guys, you write PhD theses on every EIS. And is it all necessary? Is every single word necessary? No. So there are some things, and internally I know you guys are looking at it, trying to figure out how to move things, trim things a little bit. Does it mean you can blow off or ignore certain things that are legal requirements? No. But you guys are incredibly talented. You'll figure it out, how to get things done. I like the idea of a 20-page EA. I think why not? It's been tried before. So anyway.
I don't know if it's about the regulation side of it, but I'll go back to something Gordy said before, why here, why now? And so we think on a landscape level, particularly relative to the Southwest Crown Collaborative Project, we need to understand why here, why now. And we're committed to monitoring. We're committed to monitoring effectiveness. Are we getting the work done? We're good at implementation monitoring, but we're all not so good at effectiveness monitoring. So we're committed to making sure that's done by a third party. Corey Davis is in the room today, and he's a coordinator for the monitoring committee that's been specifically hired to track this process, to coordinate this process. Part of the piece, I think I can say prioritization. I'm going to look at Julie because we sort of worry about the FACA rules. Nobody's trying to violate anything, but we're all learning the language as we go through this and try to inform our partner in terms of how to move forward. So we understand that's what we're doing. We understand that's the terminology we need to use because we're very serious about being informative. We're really trying to be participatory and be collaborative. But from a landscape level perspective, when we went into the project, we didn't know where we needed to go to operate from a landscape level perspective. We're hoping that through a prioritization process followed by the monitoring committee that we will hold ourselves accountable to saying why here, why now, in terms of understanding if we're going to treat 80%, for example, of the high priority forest fire management sites on the forest system lands, we can understand where those high priorities are. We need better information about other restoration opportunities and how to prioritize those to inform our process as we move forward, to pick places on the ground to have that landscape level effect. So we do know that this piece here that we restore has some synergy with this piece over here on a larger landscape.
Okay, I think we have time for one more quick question here.
Hi, this is sort of a question related more to the social dimensions of thinking at a larger scale, and I was just wondering about, Gary, what your constituents for something like the Blackfoot Challenge, which is a very much place-based initiative, think about you guys starting to work outside of the Blackfoot watershed and getting up into that sort of crown of the continent type scale, and how then when you're thinking at that scale things become more complex?
That's a good question. We have, I guess it's fair to say we've been found, right, the process in terms of conservation outcomes, and people are kind of saying, how come you're doing that, and how's it getting done? And so because of that, we struggle a lot with, and there's board members here in the room today that know all about the discussion, and some of our partners do too, in terms of how do we stay focused on our mission. Our mission is the Blackfoot watershed. Our mission is not the world or even a smaller subset of that. Some of the ways we've approached that is that we're really trying to manage that, if you will, to provide that outreach beyond our watershed borders. We've started with the landowners have started, based on really America's Great Outdoors and the discussions last year on June 1st, the first discussions for America's Great Outdoors were held in the Blackfoot watershed. They were led early discussions by landowners from the Rocky Mountain front, the Blackfoot, up through the Clearwater into the Swan. Those private landowners provided really two broad recommendations to our public partners, and that is capacity and flexibility. And where you go with that is kind of up to you. I mean, basically what we would say is that we know the process is working for the Blackfoot watershed in terms of community-based conservation outcomes, and we believe that if you can follow that process and stick with that process, we don't know where it's going to take you. We would be the first ones to say, it's quite frankly none of our business. But we can tell you that working inclusively with all your stakeholders, I like the way Caroline said the other day, she talked about sort of setting the table and inviting us all to the table. So when we get to the table and there's a turkey in the middle of the table, we're not going to start fighting over it. We're going to like divide it up and figure out how to be polite at the table. And basically the point is that we all need to be at the table, and as Gordy said before, picking people seems kind of manipulative, but what's important is having the values at the table. And you need to have a collaborative-minded person bringing the values to the table. If people could just embrace the concept of being inclusive and looking for some commonality, I think America would get a lot more stuff done.
Anything else to add on that?
Yeah.
All right, with that, we're going to wrap it up there. Our next panel is set to begin at 3:30, so if we could, if you guys want to take a break in between now and then, thanks again for attending.